The night smelled of smoke and salt. Constantinople's walls, once thought invincible, were splintering under the thunder of Ottoman cannons. You are a young mother clutching your infant daughter in a dimly lit room. 3 days earlier, your husband had fallen on the ramparts, his blood soaking into the stones that had shielded your people for more than 1,000 years. Now the sounds outside your door are not the clash of battle, but the rhythmic pounding of boots, the scrape of steel against wood. You know what follows is not random violence, not the chaos of a city pillaged in rage, but something far more deliberate. This was May 29th, 1453, the day an empire that had outlasted Rome itself finally collapsed. For centuries, Constantinople had been a beacon, the glittering crown of Byzantium, the crossroads of east and west, a city of mosaics and domes, scholars and merchants. But when Sultan Mehmed II breached its defences, the fall of the city was not marked only by shattered walls. It was defined by what happened to the people within them. We often remember the Ottomans for their brilliance for military strategies that outmaneuvered Europe's finest for architectural marvels like the Blue Mosque and Topkapi Palace, for centuries of imperial endurance across 3 continents. But there is another side to this story, one not carved into marble or painted in gold leaf. It is written instead in the cries of the conquered in ledgers that reduced human lives to numbers in policies that transformed intimacy itself into a weapon of empire. What began in Constantinople was not simply a sack. It was the implementation of a system carefully codified, ruthlessly efficient, and designed to ensure that no conquered population could rise again. Ottoman chroniclers recorded it with bureaucratic pride, calling it harvesting. To those who endured it, it was the machinery of despair. In those first hours after the gates fell, the city's people still believed surrender might bring mercy. After all, they knew the traditions of war, men captured as prisoners, women taken into households, some measure of chaos, followed by eventual order. What they did not yet understand was that the Ottomans had no interest in improvisation. Every scream, every separation of mother and child, every execution and branding had already been written into law, rehearsed across campaigns in Anatolia and the Balkans. And so as soldiers forced your door open, you would not meet men drunk on plunder. You would meet functionaries of an empire that had transformed conquest into procedure. To them, your body was a ledger entry, your child a calculation in an imperial policy. You were not living through the collapse of a city, but the beginning of a system. This is where our story begins, not with the cannon fire that shattered stone, but with the quieter, more insidious machinery that shattered lives. Before we continue, if this tale keeps you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from and what hour has the night brought you? When Constantinople fell, it was not simply the triumph of iron and gunpowder. The Ottomans' great cannons had thundered for weeks, their blasts shaking the land and sea walls that had withstood centuries of siege. Yet the true victory did not come when the last gate was splintered, nor when Mehmed the Conqueror rode through the shattered city. It came in what followed the swift transformation of a captured metropolis into a field laboratory for imperial policy. To the Byzantines who survived, what unfolded felt like a nightmare from which there was no waking. Chroniclers describe families torn apart in public squares, women herded into lines under the shadow of burning churches, and children wrenched from their mothers' arms as soldiers jeered. They wrote of screams echoing through Hagia Sophia, once the grandest church in Christendom, now a prison where thousands were corralled before being processed like cattle. Their words are raw, written not as detached record, but as testimony to horror. Ottoman records, by contrast, read like the cold prose of accountants. The same events described as chaos and terror in Byzantine writings appear in Turkish archives as protocols, detailed procedures that sorted, categorized, and assigned human beings to predetermined fates. These documents do not speak of grief or terror. They speak of quotas, market readiness, inventory transfers. Where the Byzantines saw children sobbing for their parents, the Ottomans saw units of labor or subjects for assimilation. This was the harvesting protocol, a standardized system for processing conquered populations. Its very name reveals its intent to treat the aftermath of war not as plunder, but as harvest, as if human beings were crops to be reaped, bundled and distributed across the empire. It was not chaos, it was administration. The Ottomans understood something chillingly modern, that the true measure of conquest was not territory alone, but the transformation of people into resources. Other empires had enslaved or deported captives, but rarely with such mechanical precision. The Byzantine chronicler Kritavoulos lamented that in less than 2 days tens of thousands were reaped as a field in season. Ottoman scribes, however, simply noted the numbers under tidy headings, the same handwriting that tracked grain taxes and herds of livestock. And this duality terror in the eyes of the conquered, routine in the hands of the conquerors, defines the story of Constantinople's fall. For the city's people, the siege ended when the walls crumbled. For the empire, the true campaign had only just begun. Once the gates were secured and the city subdued, the Ottoman soldiers turned to their next task. Not looting, not celebration, but elimination. For adult males, the verdict was swift and absolute. Any boy judged old enough to hold a weapon, typically those over 12, was marked for execution. This was not the blind rage of a conquering army, nor the chaotic slaughter of a mob. It was deliberate policy carried out in orderly groups, often after formal surrender had already taken place. Survivors wrote of fathers and sons gathered in squares forced to kneel while their wives and children watched. The executions were efficient, sometimes carried out with a single stroke of the blade, other times with volleys of arrows. But what made them most terrifying was not the violence itself, it was the ritual calm with which it was done. There was no pretense of trial, no illusion of pardon. The act was not punishment, it was procedure. The Ottomans justified these killings as a form of security, a way to prevent uprisings once their garrisons moved on. In truth, it was something deeper, an erasure of lineage. To leave men alive was to leave seeds of vengeance that could sprout years later. Even boys still on the cusp of adolescence could be seen as threats if they showed defiance, physical strength, or even the spark of leadership in their eyes. Some accounts speak of boys as young as 6 or 7 executed on suspicion that they might grow into rebels. This logic, the annihilation of male lines to extinguish future resistance, has haunted history across civilizations. The Romans, in their conquest of Carthage, slaughtered men and sold the women and children into slavery, ensuring Carthage could never rise again. In the Mongol campaigns, entire towns of men were eradicated, their skulls piled into pyramids as both warning and proof of extermination. Even in the Old Testament we read echoes of this practice, passages describing conquered peoples where every man and boy was put to the sword. The Ottomans did not invent the idea, but they codified it into their military machine. What had once been a sporadic act of vengeance became a bureaucratic routine. By reducing the act of killing to policy, they stripped it of hesitation. Soldiers no longer needed to decide who lived and who died. The law had already made the choice for them. For the mothers and sisters who witnessed it, the executions were more than physical loss. They were the deliberate destruction of a family's future. A husband cut down was tragedy. A husband and son cut down together was erasure. It severed not only bloodlines but memory, leaving women to carry both grief and the knowledge that resistance was futile. And so the courtyards of Constantinople filled with silence, broken only by the thud of bodies, the muffled cries of children, and the scratching of Ottoman scribes recording numbers. The empire had no need for speeches of mercy or declarations of conquest. The executions themselves were the message. When the killing of the men ended, the soldiers turned to the women. This too was no frenzy of plunder, no chaotic seizure of captives. It was the next stage of the harvesting protocol. In city squares, in the courtyards of churches set ablaze, women were lined up and divided with chilling efficiency, as if they were commodities awaiting shipment, rather than human beings grieving amid the ruins of their homes. The most valuable group were those between roughly 14 and 25 years old. Ottoman records from the conquest of Constantinople list more than 4,000 women in this category, each given a number, each assigned an estimated value. Chroniclers describe officers walking slowly down the lines, appraising posture, skin, teeth, hair, as if inspecting livestock. To the empire, these young women represented the highest return on investment. Their beauty commanded high prices in slave markets, and their youth promised both labour and fertility. The second group were women between 25 and 40. They were deemed past their prime for certain uses, yet still considered useful for domestic work, agriculture, or as concubines in rural households. Their lives would not be ended, but their identities would. They were stripped of names, possessions, and family, absorbed into the machinery of empire as unfree labour. For women over 40, however, the calculation was cruelly simple. They were judged a burden, mouths to feed with no expected return. Many were executed on the spot alongside the men. To the empire's administrators, sparing them would waste resources. To the families forced to watch it was the symbolic destruction of wisdom, memory, and continuity. Mothers and grandmothers, once the keepers of stories and traditions, were cut down before their daughters' eyes. The cultural meaning of these choices cannot be overstated. In societies across Byzantium and the Balkans, Family was anchored by three pillars: fathers who carried the name, mothers who sustained the household, and elders who preserved memory. By killing the men and the older women, the Ottomans severed both the line of inheritance and the chain of memory. By taking the daughters, they claimed control of the future. The family itself, the most basic unit of resistance, was dismantled piece by piece. Ottoman documents that survive in Turkish archives reveal this reality with chilling detachment. One list records item 42 females ages 15 to 22, good condition, assigned to transport Bursa; another 17 females ages 26 to 38, serviceable, assigned to agricultural households Anatolia. No names, no stories, just columns of numbers, ages, destinations. The same ledgers that recorded shipments of silk and spices also catalogued human lives. For the women forced into these categories, the process was more than physical captivity. It was the erasure of identity. Their worth was recalculated not by who they were, but by how the empire might use them. And in the quiet of those burning squares, as daughters were torn from mothers and sisters from sisters, a new truth became clear. Conquest did not end when the cannons fell silent. It continued in the lives stripped bare and rewritten in the ink of imperial record keepers. If men were executed and women harvested, the fate of children was perhaps the most chilling demonstration of Ottoman policy. For the empire, children were not seen as innocents. They were opportunities, raw clay to be moulded into tools of state power. Boys between the ages of 8 and 12 were swept into the devshirme system, a levy that transformed Christian sons into soldiers of the Sultan. Torn from their families, renamed circumcised, and drilled into obedience, they became janissaries, the elite infantry who would one day return to fight against their own people. The Ottomans knew that by severing boys from their heritage and remoulding them under Islamic and imperial discipline, they not only gained soldiers but erased potential rebels. What better way to extinguish resistance than to turn a father's son into the sword that might one day cut down his king girls under 12 were processed differently. Ottoman records refer to formation programs, an innocuous phrase that hides the reality of cultural annihilation. These children were placed in households or state facilities where they were groomed for servitude, often prepared for future roles within the imperial hierarchy as servants, concubines, or wives strategically placed to bind conquered territories to the empire. They were trained to forget their language, their faith, their families. Within a generation, an entire identity could vanish without leaving a trace. The cruelty of these separations lay not only in what was done to the children, but in how it was done. Families were forced to watch as their sons and daughters were dragged away, categorized like livestock. Chroniclers describe mothers clawing at soldiers' tunics, begging to hold their children one last time. Infants were sometimes torn from their mother's arms and killed immediately, not out of military necessity, but as psychological warfare. Ottoman soldiers knew that the sight of a baby dashed against the ground would shatter a mother's spirit more completely than any beating. It sent the message, your resistance will not save your children. Submission is your only chance to preserve life. For mothers, the agony was twofold. They suffered the immediate loss of their children, but also the torment of imagining what would become of them. Would their sons grow to despise them as infidels? Would their daughters even remember they once had families, or would they be taught to spit on the faith of their ancestors? These questions were not accidents. They were the empire's most effective weapon. Other empires had enslaved the children of the conquered, the Mongols conscripting youth into their hordes, or the Romans parading children in triumphs before selling them into slavery. But the Ottomans perfected the system, embedding it into law, regulating it with precision, and turning childhood into a currency of empire. To take a man's life was to end his story. To take his child was to rewrite it, bending future generations toward the conqueror's will. In this way, the Ottomans harvested not only the present of Constantinople, but its future one child at a time. Within just 48 hours of Constantinople's fall, the machinery of conquest had processed nearly 50,000 souls. The numbers a staggering 12,000 women and girls packed onto ships bound for the markets of Bursa, Ankara, and further still into the deep arteries of the empire. 8,000 more parcelled out directly among the soldiers as spoils of victory. The rest men, the elderly, the unwanted, had already been executed or abandoned to starvation. The city that had once boasted 500,000 residents was in the span of 2 days transformed into a husk haunted by smoke and silence. The Ottomans wasted no time. Slave markets across the empire had long been prepared for such influxes. In Istanbul, freshly renamed after the conquest, a sprawling bazaar operated with specialized sections where human beings were displayed and priced alongside spices, silks, and gems. In Bursa, the old capital, entire courtyards were dedicated to the trade, with stalls organised by age, skill and origin. Cairo, though not under Mehmed's direct rule at the time, connected through Ottoman trading partners, acted as one of the great crossroads of Mediterranean slavery, feeding demand across North Africa and the Middle East. Surviving records describe the system in blunt detail: daily auctions where buyers inspected teeth, and skin clerks noting prices that fluctuated with supply and demand, contracts sealed with seals and witnesses. A Greek girl of 17 might fetch 30 silver coins in Istanbul, a skilled seamstress more. Young boys destined for training as palace pages were sold at higher premiums, reflecting their potential long-term value to the state. Every person was reduced to a ledger entry, their lives quantified in currency. To modernize, it is impossible not to see parallels with another great system of human trafficking now, the transatlantic slave trade that would emerge a century later. The similarities are striking: ship manifests listing human cargo beside commercial goods, mortality rates calculated as acceptable losses, markets that treated the enslaved as commodities rather than people. But where the Atlantic trade was driven by European colonization and plantation economies, the Ottoman system was fueled by conquest and the need to bind diverse populations under one imperial order. Both were vast, brutal and deeply systematic, but the Ottoman model had already industrialized human misery before Europeans set sail for Africa. And yet what makes the Ottoman harvest of Constantinople uniquely horrifying is not only its scale, but its speed. 50,000 lives dismantled in 2 days, identities arrested with bureaucratic precision. It was conquest measured not in territory gained, but in people reduced to inventory, scattered across continents to vanish into the bloodstream of an empire. For the survivors marched into slave markets, the fall of Constantinople was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new captivity, one meticulously prepared long before the city's walls crumbled. Once captives were herded onto ships, their fate was sealed not by mercy or cruelty, but by paperwork. Ottoman scribes recorded them with the same dry efficiency used to tally spices, metals, or timber. Surviving manifests tell us what those ships carried: bolts of Damascus, silk sacks of pepper, barrels of wine and human beings. One typical entry reads 20 bolts, Damascus silk, 40 measures black pepper, 15 females aged 16-20, excellent condition. There is something chilling about the casual placement of those words. Lives reduced to a commodity line between merchandise, as if a girl of 16 were no different from a roll of fabric or a crate of spice. This was not exaggeration in hostile chronicles. It was the empire's own accounting, written by its clerks with ink and seal meant for internal record, not propaganda. The integration of human beings into Ottoman commerce reveals just how deeply slavery was woven into the empire's economic system. Captives weren't a byproduct of conquest, they were its yield. Slavery fed every layer of Ottoman society, soldiers rewarded with concubines, markets enriched by fresh stock, households supplied with servants, and state coffers filled with taxes collected on every transaction. It was not an accident of war, it was an industry, and as with any industry, value was determined by demand. Young women from Greece, the Balkans and Anatolia were prized in Istanbul markets, their prices rising and falling like any other commodity. Traders speculated holding captives until festivals or pilgrimage seasons when demand surged. Girls with particular skills, needlework, music literacy, were appraised higher. Even skin tone, hair colour and eye shade influenced their market price, producing what we might grimly call an aesthetics economy. This commodification eroded humanity into categories and numbers. Once recorded in ledgers, a captive ceased to exist as Maria or Eleni or Sophia. She became female 17, good condition. Her identity, her memories, her family ties were erased by the stroke of a clerk's pen. And once reduced to a number, she could be exchanged, resold, inherited, or lost like any other asset. The historian Fernand Braudel once described the Mediterranean as an ocean of exchanges. Within that ocean, the Ottomans turned people into part of the same current that carried grain, sugar, silk and silver. To look at the manifest today is to feel the coldness of a system where suffering was measured in balance sheets, where the cries of the conquered disappeared beneath the rustle of parchment. In those pages, the walls of Constantinople crumble all over again, not in stone and fire, but in ink that transforms human lives into inventory. In the days following Constantinople's fall, the human harvest moved from battlefield to marketplace. Across the empire, specialized bazaars buzzed with the trade of flesh, their stalls arranged, not unlike those selling textiles or livestock. Buyers haggled over prices, appraising the condition of captives, smooth skin, strong limb signs of fertility or skill. Values fluctuated with supply and demand. When conquests brought an influx of women from Greece or Serbia, prices dropped. When campaigns stalled and the supply thinned, prices soared. Human worth rose and fell like any other commodity. The Ottomans, with their love of meticulous record-keeping, left behind bills of sale, transport receipts, and inventories that read with bureaucratic calm. A merchant's account might note one girl age 18 blonde literate, sold for 30 silver pieces transferred with seal of approval. Another, 2 boys ages 9 and 11 suitable for training assigned to Janissary Corps. The precision is suffocating cries, and resistance vanish into the lines of ink as if the terror of a family torn apart were nothing more than a completed transaction. This was not random chaos, it was standardization. The Ottomans built a system that resembled a corporation, more than a medieval army. Conquests produced raw materials, administrators ensured proper distribution, traders managed regional markets, and the state collected taxes and fees at every step. The result was an economy in which human trauma itself was monetized, transformed into a source of profit that fueled further expansion. Profit incentives shaped imperial policy in ways both obvious and insidious. Military commanders received bonuses for the number of captives delivered. Traders who supplied high-quality stock won favor in contracts. Even soldiers measured their success not only in loot or land, but in the number of captives they could claim as personal property. The human suffering of the conquered Demetrius became the currency of reward, embedding exploitation into the very fabric of empire. What made this system particularly durable was its ability to renew itself. Each conquest produced fresh streams of captives, feeding markets, rewarding soldiers, and enriching the state. The cycle created its own momentum. The more the empire expanded, the more its leaders depended on slavery as a pillar of both economy and morale. Like a corporation addicted to growth, the Ottoman system required constant harvests of new populations to sustain itself. And just as corporations today shape policy through profit motives, so too does this economy of trauma shape Ottoman decisions of war and peace. Campaigns were chosen not only for strategic territory, but for the promise of captives. An army's success was measured not only by the cities it took, but by the thousands of human beings it delivered to the marketplace. In this way, the fall of Constantinople reveals a darker truth. Empires are not sustained by glory alone, but by the calculated exploitation of human lives. For the Ottomans, trauma itself became a commodity harvested, priced and sold in markets that turned grief into silver. If cannons broke the walls of Constantinople, it was terror that subdued the lands beyond them. The Ottomans understood that raw power was costly to maintain, but fear could travel faster and last longer than any army. After Constantinople, their reputation became a weapon in its own right, a whisper more effective than a sword. Word spread quickly of what had happened within the city. Not only the slaughter of men or the chains of captives, but the systematic humiliation of women and children. Mothers forced to watch daughters, branded infants, torn from arms, grandmothers executed before their families. These stories were not accidents of rumour, they were cultivated. Ottoman chroniclers themselves recorded them, ensuring tales of horror moved with the empire's armies. Fear became part of the arsenal deployed ahead of the soldiers who followed. The impact was profound. Villages in the Balkans and Anatolia, hearing of Constantinople's fate, often surrendered at the first sight of Ottoman banners. Gates opened without resistance, not because defenders lacked weapons, but because they lacked hope. To fight meant to invite the full machinery of the harvesting protocol. To yield meant at least the possibility of survival. And so entire towns chose submission before a single arrow was loosed. This strategy echoes another empire that weaponized dread with devastating success, the Mongols. When Genghis Khan's armies rode across Asia, they left pyramids of skulls as markers of their passage. Cities capitulated rather than face annihilation because the memory of massacres travelled faster than horsemen. But while Mongol terror relied on visible spectacle, the ruins of towns, the towers of bones, the Ottomans deployed something subtler. The intimate fear of what would be done to families. They knew that the destruction of women and children left scars that outlasted battlefields. Ottoman commanders calculated that one well-publicized atrocity could prevent a dozen sieges. Why waste men and resources battering walls when fear itself could open the gates, and so they allowed even encouraged accounts of their brutality to circulate. European envoys hearing the stories carried them further, still spreading the image of an empire not only militarily powerful, but mercilessly efficient in its exploitation of the conquered. In this way, fear became cheaper than steel. It saved armies from prolonged campaigns, ensured smoother conquests, and dismantled resistance before it had a chance to form. The screams of Constantinople's victims echoed far beyond its walls, reshaping the decisions of towns and kingdoms hundreds of miles away. The lesson was clear to those who lived under the empire's shadow. You did not resist the Ottomans, not because you could not fight, but because you could not bear to imagine what would be done if you lost. Long after the smoke of Constantinople faded, its memory remained a weapon sharper than any blade. The Ottomans had learned that the most efficient conquest was not the one won through bloodshed, but the one surrendered before the first arrow was loosed. Fear could march ahead of their armies, subduing cities without the cost of a siege. The stories that spread were not only about toppled walls or fallen emperors. They were about women stripped, sorted, sold. About children torn from their mothers' arms, renamed and remade. About men marched into squares and executed in lines. These accounts carried a special kind of terror because they struck at the very heart of family life. Every listener could imagine their own daughter, their own son, their own wife in such scenes. And crucially, the Ottomans ensured these tales travelled. Captives released intentionally, merchants whispering in taverns, clerics repeating what they had seen, all became vessels of empire. To hear that Constantinople had fallen was one thing. To hear how its people had been processed was another. Fear was cultivated like a crop harvested again and again as villages chose surrender rather than risk the horrors they had heard described. This tactic was not new. A century earlier, the Mongols had perfected the use of terror as strategy. They built pyramids of skulls outside conquered cities versus spreading the message resist and perish utterly. But where Mongol cruelty was overt and monumental, the Ottomans' terror worked at a more intimate level. Instead of skull towers, they used the destruction of families. Instead of ruins left smoking in the desert, they left whispers of daughters enslaved and infants slain. Both methods achieved the same result: gates opening without a fight, cities capitulating in dread of what might come. For the Ottomans, this fear was worth more than any cannon. A successful campaign did not always mean storming fortifications. Often it meant arriving at city gates already opened by trembling hands. And so they allowed the stories to grow, even embellished them in their own chronicles. Accounts of suffering became tools of empire, a psychological siege laid across entire regions. To those who lived in villages along the Balkans or in the mountains of Anatolia, the lesson was plain: resist, and your family will be unmade. Yield, and perhaps a fragment of life will remain. The Ottomans didn't need to fight every battle. Fear fought for them, and it rarely lost. The conquest of Constantinople did not end when its gates fell, nor even when its markets swelled with the first tide of captives. For thousands of women, the next chapter of captivity began at the water's edge. Ottoman ships built to carry silk and spices across the Mediterranean were now repurposed to carry human cargo. Their holds became floating prisons where the cries of the enslaved mingled with the groan of timber and the crash of waves. The empire measured its losses with chilling detachment. Mortality rates during transport averaged 15% figures as recorded in ledgers, as if they referred to spoiled grain. A woman who perished of thirst, disease, or despair was marked as an acceptable loss. Her body, stripped of identity, was heaved into the sea where her absence was tallied in the same ink that tracked barrels of olive oil or bales of cotton. Once aboard, captives were stripped of names and clothed in coarse garments that marked them as property. They were branded in ledgers not with fire, but with numbers. A girl once called Eleni or Aisha became female, aged 17, fair-skinned, serviceable. The renaming was not an afterthought. It was deliberate erasure, a way to break the chain that bound them to family and homeland. To be reduced to an entry was to be remade in the image of the empire, anonymous, exchangeable, forgotten. Maritime archaeology has uncovered evidence that confirms this grim trade. Excavations of Ottoman wrecks reveal adaptations made to galleys and cargo ships, ventilation slats carved into bulkheads, cisterns enlarged to store water, drainage systems cut into decks. These were not luxuries for passengers, but necessities for keeping dozens of captives alive in stifling conditions. The Ottomans, like later transatlantic traders, discovered that a balance had to be struck. Too much cruelty and cargo died. Too much care and profits fell. The journeys themselves could last weeks, sometimes months, depending on winds and destination. In the darkness of the holds, chained women endured hunger, stench, and the unending terror of the unknown. Some sang lullabies in whispers, trying to soothe crying children who had not survived the voyage. Others fell, retreating inward, clinging to memories that would soon blur under the pressure of trauma. The sea became both passage and grave. Every wave that rocked those ships carried lives away from the shores they would never see again. And when the vessels finally reached the ports of Bursa, Istanbul, or beyond, the captives emerged not as survivors but as commodities stripped broken and ready for the markets that awaited them. For the Ottomans, the transport was efficient, necessary, and profitable. For those bound below decks, it was the passage into darkness where identity dissolved and survival itself became a cruel lottery. Perhaps the most unsettling feature of Ottoman conquest was not only what happened in the heat of battle, but what happened afterward in the calm of courts and councils. Violence was not merely tolerated. It was legalized, folded into the very framework of the imperial law. What other empires treated as excess or atrocity, the Ottomans enshrined as procedure. Rape, for example, was transformed into marriage through legal sleight of hand. A captive woman forced into the bed of her conqueror was declared his wife under certain interpretations of Islamic jurisprudence. Her consent was irrelevant. Her new status was recorded as a form of protection, but in truth it bound her permanently to the man who had destroyed her family. Slavery, too, was granted divine mandate. Legal scholars wrote fatwas declaring captives the rightful property of their captors, a gift sanctioned by victory and blessed by God. What began as trauma was laundered into law given the illusion of sanctity. One of the most disturbing doctrines was the concept of the war wife. When an Ottoman soldier killed a man in battle, that man's widow was legally transferred to the victor as part of the spoils. This was not folklore, not custom whispered among soldiers, it was codified in military law. The claiming process required 3 witnesses and had to be completed within 72 hours, after which others could contest the right of ownership. Women became the subject of property disputes argued over in court records, with the same tone used for livestock or land. Cultural and religious justifications smoothed the brutality into something that appeared orderly, even righteous. Islamic legal scholars cited early precedents of slavery and concubinage, arguing that conquest legitimized ownership of non-Muslim captives. Sultans presented these practices as acts of mercy, claiming that by incorporating captives into Muslim households they were rescuing them from unbelief. Over time, such reasoning hardened into normalization. Generations grew up believing this was not cruelty but duty, not exploitation but divine order. The long-term consequences of such codification were profound. By legalizing sexual violence, the Ottomans transformed it from crime into routine, from shame into structure. Soldiers were not dissuaded from abuse, they were incentivized. Families of victims had no legal recourse because the law itself had decreed their suffering legitimate. The system perpetuated itself across centuries, each conquest feeding the legal machine that turned human grief into imperial stability. When we read these laws today, preserved in archives with meticulous detail, the chilling realization emerges: the horror lay not only in the acts themselves, but in how thoroughly they were normalized. Violence became paperwork and suffering became precedent. In the empire's eyes, what was done to women and children was not atrocity. It was justice sanctified by law and sealed by faith. If execution and enslavement shattered bodies, conversion shattered the soul. For women and children captured by the Ottomans, the process of erasing identity was not left to chance. It was industrialized, designed with the same ruthless efficiency as any military campaign. The first step was renaming. A girl called Sophia became Aisha. A boy named Nikolaos was rewritten as Mustafa. Names that once tied them to family saints and ancestry were stripped away and replaced with words that marked their rebirth into imperial property. This act was more than symbolic. To lose one's name was to lose the first anchor of memory. The next step was humiliation. Captives were forced into public ceremonies of rejection, denouncing their former faith, spitting on icons, burning crosses or prayer books. Witnesses recorded these rituals with disturbing pride, framing them as triumphs of Islam over infidelity. For the captives, it was degradation designed to break their inner resistance. Even refusal was anticipated. Those who resisted were beaten, starved, or threatened with the deaths of their children, until they yielded. Excavations in Adrianople and Bursa have revealed the physical remains of these conversion centres. Archaeologists uncovered narrow chambers with heavy doors, drainage systems suggesting confinement, and courtyards suited for stage ceremonies. These were not ordinary houses or schools, they were facilities built to process human beings, designed for psychological warfare. The programs typically lasted 6 months, long enough to ensure the captives' languages faded, their memories dulled, and crucially that many women became pregnant. Systematic rape was not incidental but structural. Pregnancy created a biological bond that made return to the past impossible. A child conceived under captivity tied a woman to the empire more effectively than chains ever could. Once her body bore the empire's blood, she was less a prisoner and more a vessel of assimilation. This fusion of psychological and biological bondage was devastatingly effective. Mothers who bore children were less likely to resist their maternal instincts weaponized against them. Children born from these forced unions were raised without knowledge of their true heritage, growing up as Ottoman subjects who knew nothing of their mother's original names, faiths, or homelands. Other empires had forced conversions, medieval Spain with its conversos or Charlemagne's campaigns against the Saxons. But the Ottomans refined the process into an institution. By combining renaming, ritual, humiliation, and reproductive control, they erased identity with terrifying completeness. The result was not just the destruction of individuals, but the slow erasure of entire peoples. A culture does not vanish in one battle, but when its children forget the songs of their mothers, when its women bear children who will never know their ancestors, and when its names are erased from memory and inked over in new ledgers. This was the Ottoman genius for control, not simply conquering bodies, but remaking souls. For the women forced into the Ottoman system, captivity did not end with conversion. It continued in their children, whose very existence became part of the empire's machinery. These offspring were not simply born into families, they were claimed by the state as instruments of policy. Some infants, particularly those whose features too closely resembled their mothers, were killed outright. A child who bore the obvious mark of a Greek or Serbian father was inconvenient, a living reminder of rape. The Ottomans calculated that such children carried the risk of rebellion or resentment, and so they were erased before they could grow. Others were repurposed, absorbed into the empire's vast networks of servitude, training and control. Mixed-blood boys who survived were often taken at a young age, raised in isolation and groomed for military or bureaucratic service. By the time they were old enough to question their origins, they had no memory of their mother's language or culture. Girls were judged on physical attributes, some consigned to domestic servitude, others selected to repeat the same cycle of enforced reproduction that had bound their mothers. Their lives were shaped not by family but by imperial design. The long-term cultural erasure was profound. Entire generations grew up without names that connected them to the past, without lullabies that carried ancestral memory, without the faith of their parents or the languages of their homelands. Instead, they inherited identities manufactured by the state. By severing the line between mother and child, the Ottomans ensured that the trauma of conquest became a permanent transformation, dissolving cultures into the bloodstream of the empire. This was not incidental. It was a form of biological and cultural engineering. The empire understood that the most lasting conquest was not of cities or fortresses, but of memory itself. A captured woman could one day escape or resist. A captured child raised in ignorance of who they once were could not. History offers few parallels to the completeness of this transformation. The Romans had absorbed conquered elites by offering citizenship. The Mongols had folded warriors into their hordes through allegiance. But the Ottomans went further. They reshaped populations at the root, using the bodies of women and the moulding of children to erase entire peoples across generations. To read the records today is to see not only the violence of the moment, but its echoes across centuries. A child raised never knowing his father's name, a girl taught to despise the faith of her grandmother, these were not accidents of war. They were deliberate policies calculated to make the past vanish and the empire endure. And so the children of trauma became the empire's most potent weapon, living proof that identity itself could be conquered, erased, and rewritten. The word devshirm usually conjures the image of boys' young Christian sons taken from their families, converted and forged into janissaries. But the levy did not stop at the male line. Far less remembered, yet equally devastating, was the tribute of daughters. Girls, too, were swept into the empire's machinery, their bodies harvested not for the battlefield, but for the bedchamber, the household, and the breeding pen. Ottoman records sparse a quieter, almost ashamed hint at this parallel system. Families were forced to surrender daughters as part of their tax to the empire, just as they gave sons. Unlike the boys who could sometimes rise to power within the janissary corps, these girls vanished into obscurity. Many were funneled into households as servants or concubines, others disappeared into the vast harem system. And too many ended in breeding programs designed to maximize the empire's human yield. The mortality rates among these girls were staggering. Contemporary estimates suggest nearly 40% did not survive their first year of captivity, succumbing to abuse, malnutrition, or disease. To Ottoman administrators, these deaths were written off as wastage and acceptable cost in the balance sheets of empire. To their families, it was the echo of a daughter's laughter silenced forever, her absence a wound that would never heal. The tribute system reinforced imperial dominance in more ways than one, by demanding not only taxes of coin and grain, but the very flesh of children. The empire reminded subject populations of their utter helplessness. A village that watched its sons and daughters marched away in chains understood that resistance was futile. Tribute was not simply payment, it was humiliation, incarnate, a ritual stripping of dignity that bound entire communities in submission. The most disturbing dimension of this system lay in the breeding programs. Women taken through the levy were often managed with the cold precision reserved for livestock. Records track their ages, fertility, number of births, and rates of survival. Those deemed productive were given slightly better rations, medical attention, and controlled environments, investments to preserve imperial assets. Those who failed to conceive or who bore too many infants that died were discarded, shifted into harsh labour until their bodies broke. In these programs, the human body itself became a tool of empire, its cycles monitored and manipulated for imperial gain. Every child born was a victory, not of love or family, but of policy. Each pregnancy was another link in a chain that bound subject peoples tighter to the Ottoman system, dissolving memory and replacing it with blood loyal to the Sultan. To speak of the tribute of daughters is to confront a silence in the historical record, a silence born of shame and deliberate forgetting. Yet it was real and it shaped generations. The daughters of Europe and Anatolia surrendered to the levy became both victims and instruments of empire, living proof that the conquest of a people is never complete until it claims not only their land, but their children. Conquest did not always come with banners and cannons. For many communities on the empire's borders, the greater terror was seasonal, the sudden arrival of Ottoman raiders sweeping through valleys and villages not for land but for flesh. These raids were deliberate, calculated expeditions conducted for one purpose: to replenish the empire's human stock. They followed a rhythm as predictable as harvests. Spring and summer, when roads were passable and fields full, were also the seasons of capture. Scouts rode ahead, mapping villages and identifying the healthiest children, the most beautiful young women, the strongest boys. Then came the riders, fast, ruthless, and mercilessly efficient. They did not seek pitched battles. They sought doors, left unguarded families asleep and children playing in courtyards. By the time the smoke rose, the captives were already bound and marching toward Ottoman markets. Faced with this recurring nightmare, families developed desperate strategies. Parents scarred their daughters' faces, hoping to make them less desirable to raiders. Others maimed them, breaking teeth, cutting hair, even crippling limbs, acts of violence committed out of love, sacrifices meant to save a child from a worse fate. Communities dug secret chambers beneath homes or carved hiding places into forests and mountains. In some regions, entire underground networks were constructed where women and children could vanish during raid season, listening in silence as hoofbeats thundered overhead. But the Ottomans adapted. Torture was routinely used to force captured villagers to reveal hiding places. Fires set to barns smoked fugitives out of underground chambers. Threats against parents made siblings betray one another. No hiding place was safe for long. The empire's administrators understood that terror worked best when no sanctuary could be trusted. Over time, these raids left cultural scars as deep as the physical ones. Folklore across the Balkans, Greece, and Anatolia still carries echoes of them. Songs sung in hushed tones speak of daughters carried off by the dark riders. Fairy tales disguised warnings for children: never wander far, or the Sultan's men will take you. Even lullabies held double meanings: comfort for the infant, and reminders to the mother of the dangers waiting just beyond the hearth. The persistence of these traditions tells us something important. The raids were not isolated incidents, nor exaggerated legends. They were seasonal certainties woven into the rhythm of rural life. Entire cultures bent themselves around the task of survival, their folklore becoming a kind of collective memory, a way to encode the trauma so it would never be forgotten. For the empire, raids were logistics. For the conquered, they were the shadow that returned every year, carrying away daughters, sons, and hope itself. The Ottomans did not need to raise walls of skulls like the Mongols. The empty cradles and the whispered songs of terrified mothers were monuments enough. When terror becomes predictable, it ceases to be an interruption. It becomes the organizing principle of life. In the shadow of the Ottoman frontier, entire societies reshaped themselves around the task of protecting women and children from abduction. Marriage customs shifted. In some villages, brides were wed at startlingly young ages in hopes that matrimony might shield them from being taken as tribute. Families built homes with hidden cellars, narrow tunnels, and false walls. Architecture born not of style but of fear. Clothing traditions too were altered. Girls dressed plainly, their hair shorn or faces darkened with soot when rumours of raids spread a camouflage of ugliness meant to deflect predatory eyes. Songs and myths absorbed these anxieties. Folk ballads told of maidens carried across rivers by foreign riders, their voices turning into birds so that they could still cry for home. Lullabies doubled as warnings, mothers whispering to infants of dangers waiting in the night. In parts of the Balkans, entire oral traditions grew around the figure of the taken daughter. Her story passed down not as history, but as cautionary tale reminders that what happened once could happen again. These cultural adaptations were more than survival strategies. They were symptoms of intergenerational trauma. A grandmother who once hid in a forest cave as a child might sing to her granddaughter the same songs she had heard then, not out of nostalgia, but out of compulsion. Fear, carried in memory, became tradition. Entire communities lived with a constant low hum of dread shaping choices about marriage work and even where to settle land. Yet amid the scars there were also veins of resistance. Oral traditions sometimes inverted the narrative, transforming stolen daughters into symbols of endurance or cunning. Legends spoke of women who escaped their captors, who threw themselves into rivers rather than be taken, or who smuggled messages back to their families across generations. These stories became a kind of quiet rebellion, proof that identity could endure even when bodies could not. The persistence of these cultural scars is striking. Long after Ottoman power waned, villages in southeastern Europe and Anatolia still told stories of harvest time raids, still whispered lullabies with shadows in their lyrics. Even into the 19th and 20th centuries, communities carried rituals whose origins lay not in faith or celebration, but in fear of abduction. Trauma had outlived empire, embedding itself into the fabric of daily life. To study these customs today is to glimpse not only the brutality of the past, but its echo across centuries. The empire may have crumbled, its banners torn down and its markets emptied, but its shadow remained etched in songs and myths, in the architecture of homes and the silence of mothers. Terror had been more than a weapon. It had been a culture, one whose scars never fully healed. The most unsettling truth of the Ottoman conquest lies not only in the violence of the moment, but in the precision with which it was recorded. In archives scattered across Istanbul and Ankara, one finds not epic chronicles of glory, but breeding registers, ledgers that track pregnancies, infant survival rates, and the productive lifespan of captive women. Medical reports survive, penned by physicians employed to maximize fertility, describing procedures to strengthen wombs or prolong reproductive years. Architectural blueprints of conversion centers reveal buildings designed like factories optimized for surveillance, confinement, and control. This was exploitation raised to an industrial scale. Not a frenzy of cruelty, but a system managed with bureaucratic pride. What the Byzantines remembered as nightmare, the Ottomans catalogued as achievement. The same ink that tracked shipments of silk and spices calmly recorded the destruction of families, the reshaping of cultures, and the breaking of generations. The normalization of horror was perhaps the empire's greatest triumph and its most enduring crime. When atrocity becomes law, it ceases to feel like atrocity to those who enforce it. Soldiers no longer saw themselves as violators. They saw themselves as rightful owners. Clerks no longer felt the sting of recording a child's separation from her mother. They saw only inventory. And rulers no longer questioned the morality of conquest. They spoke of divine mandate and imperial necessity. Violence, once legalized and routinized, vanished into the machinery of everyday life. This is the lesson that lingers long after the walls of Constantinople crumbled. Empires do not endure by force alone. They endure by convincing themselves and their subjects that brutality is order, that exploitation is law, that suffering is destiny. The Ottomans perfected this alchemy, turning horror into administration and despair into statistics. But history does not forget so easily. In the songs of the Balkans, in the whispered folktales of Anatolia, in the scars carried across generations, the truth persisted. Behind every ledger entry marked female age 16, good condition was a name, a family, a story erased but not entirely lost. And so as we look back on the fall of Constantinople and the system it birthed, we find not only a record of what was done, but a warning of what can be done again. Power unchecked, draped in the language of law, will always find a way to normalize the unthinkable. The Ottomans did not invent that truth. They merely showed how far it could be taken. The final image is not of cannon fire or toppled walls, but of a clerk's pen scratching across parchment, turning human lives into inventory. A reminder that conquest does not always roar. It can also whisper in ledgers and laws until cruelty itself becomes ordinary. And that is the legacy of a dark system, the ease with which humanity can vanish when power writes the rules. Lessons from a dark system. What the fall of Constantinople teaches us today. History often tempts us to think of conquest as something that ends when the armies march out and the dust settles. But the fall of Constantinople in 1453 reveals that conquest does not stop at walls or swords. It seeps into the fabric of human lives, redefining families, reshaping societies, and even writing itself into law. The Ottomans did not simply take a city, they engineered a system of control that turned human beings into commodities and trauma into policy. When we examine this history, uncomfortable lessons emerge that reach far beyond the 15th century. The first is that atrocity becomes most dangerous when it is normalized. The Ottomans did not justify their violence as chaos or accident. They codified it as law. What we might see as horror, they saw as procedure. This reminds us that the greatest threats to human dignity often hide behind paperwork and ritual. Once something is written into law or normalized as the way things are, it becomes far harder to resist. A second lesson lies in the power of fear as a weapon. The Ottomans discovered that the reputation of brutality could achieve more than 1,000 cannons. Entire towns surrendered before a battle was fought simply because they feared the suffering they had heard described. This is not confined to empires. Even today, systems of intimidation, whether in politics, workplaces, or communities, can silence resistance before it begins. Fear travels faster than truth, and it shapes behavior long after the initial act of violence. Third, the story reveals how erasing identity is a form of conquest more enduring than death. Killing a soldier ends a life. Remaking his child into an agena of empire ends a lineage. The Ottomans understood this, using conversion centers, renaming rituals, and breeding programs to erase memory across generations. For us, the warning is clear. Whenever identity, whether cultural, religious, or personal, is stripped away and replaced by imposed conformity, the result is not strength but loss. To honor our identities and those of others is to guard against erasure. Perhaps the most haunting lesson is how ordinary people participated in extraordinary cruelty. Soldiers, scribes, clerks, and merchants all played their part, often believing they were simply doing their jobs. The machinery of oppression rarely requires monsters. It requires ordinary people willing to look away to accept the rules, to value convenience or profit over compassion. That truth forces us to ask in our own lives, where do we risk becoming the clerk with the pen quietly reducing someone's dignity to a number? Finally, the fall of Constantinople warns us about the fragility of humanity under unchecked power. When authority is absolute, when systems face no accountability, exploitation is not just possible, it is inevitable. The archives show us what happens when power answers to no one, cruelty becomes industry and suffering becomes currency. If there is a redemptive thread here, it is this: the memory of those lives, though reduced to ledgers, was never entirely erased. Songs, stories, and scars carried the truth across generations. In remembering them, we honor not only their suffering, but also their resistance. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson: power can erase names from ledgers, but it cannot erase the responsibility of the living to remember and to choose differently. Thanks for being here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapters full of history and discovery.